Good evening, students. I hope you are all doing very well. Today, we are going to look at audit evidence as part of the Module 1. This one is supposed to be Unit 3. So let us look at the standards on audit evidence. When I talk about standards, I'm referring to international standard on auditing. So the ISA requires that auditor should obtain relevant and of course, reliable audit evidence that is sufficient enough to enable him draw a reasonable conclusion therefrom. That is, enable him draw a reasonable conclusion expressing his opinion on the financial statement. So what is audit evidence? Audit evidence is literally or simply put, is any kind of information from any source that will enable, whether written or oral, that will enable the auditor to draw a reasonable conclusion as he expresses his opinion, or rightly put, source, written or oral, obtained by the auditor to support the conclusion on which he bases his opinion on the financial statement. So, talking about audit evidence, we all know what is evidence. When you are a student, if you ask students of which school, you will say, I'm from UNN, I'm from UNEC, I'm from NAU. What makes you a student is your ID card, your registration number, and probably your uniform. Let me say, those of them that wear uniform, like in our faculty. So if you liken that to auditors' audit evidence, you find out that audit evidence refers to those information that will enable the auditor to express a reliable and a reasonable opinion. And these sources, he can get this audit evidence from so many sources. So many sources, just going by the definition, from any source. So let us look at the sources of audit evidence. Of course, you know, the main sources or the primary source of audit evidence should be the accounting system, the accounting records kept by the client. Another source is the tangible assets of the client. We also have the management and other employees. For instance, auditor might decide to ask questions, interview some of the employees of the clients. Then you can get, the sources can come from the customers, suppliers, or creditors. It can come from other third parties that have one or two things to do with the clients. It can also come from the minutes of the meeting of the client, several meetings they have held. The audit evidence, the auditor can also get it from competitive, comparable data about a competitor. He can also get it from contract control manuals. He can also get it from observation, inspection. There are so many sources of audit evidence. These are financial sources. One can also talk about the non-financial sources of audit evidence, which includes the organogram. Yes, organogram is not financial in nature, but the auditor can make use of organogram to some extent. So from all these, the sources are so many. From all these, the information that will be gathered from all these sources will be so enormous that the auditor will only manage this information based on his experience and his judgments, his discretion. The ISA is not expecting that, or did not expect the auditor to use all the information gathered for his audit evidence. He expects the auditor to graduate them, to arrange them in accordance, in order of importance and in order of superiority. Because if he intends to make use of all the information will be it cannot be managed. So we all can understand, in a little simple sense, can also tell us that information that is gathered and documented is more reliable than the one that he got from oral explanation. And of course, if you want to make use of those things, these are the things that he will consider. He will consider the whether it is oral and whether it is documented. He will also consider the degree of the knowledge of the clients, the degree of the importance of the information to the clients. He has some features or some characteristics as a good professional to judge, employ his discretion while he's trying to separate the important information and the non-important information. He will also consider the degree of the risk of misplacement, degree of misstatement, as in what will happen to the client if he eliminates a particular information. We'll consider that. He will also look at which information is most important to the management, as in sometimes some management staff will tell you to do it the way we do it. Don't change it and this and that. That is what we call management override. So he will consider the information, whether it's the one that the staff wants to maintain or the one they want to throw away. That will also help him to know the ones to collect, the ones to retain, and the ones to discard. We also look at the financial position of the clients. Some evidence are even more superior than the other. So he will, I've said it before, he will probably accept or consider the information that is documented rather than the one that is oral. And also you can attest or you can agree with me that information that originated from him through analytical reviews should be more important to him to consider than information related from another person. It is worthy to note here that when two information conflicts, that is to say, an auditor interviewed an employee told him that they are valuing their stock using FIFO, and interviewed another employee, and the employee told him that they are using the LIFO method for stock valuation. You see, the two information is contradicting. So the auditor is not expected to take anyone he wants at this time, at this level, but he is expected to conduct more investigation, to ask more questions in order to validate and consolidate the one he decides to choose, as in the one that is consistent. So that is a very good point. In case if you are asked in exam, what should the auditor do when you have two conflicting audit evidence? So when I've just said it, when it conflicts, he should inquire more. In other words, when audit evidence obtained from one source is in conflict with the other source, the reliability remains in doubt. Thus, another additional evidence will be needed to resolve the inconsistency. I've given you an example. So let us look at the audit tests. The test the auditor is expected to conduct in order to validate his audit evidence. One of the tests is compliance test. The other is called the substantive test. The compliance tests are those tests designated to provide evidence as to whether the internal control procedure are being operated as planned. That is to say, whether the internal control procedure is functional. Some organizations might have internal control measures, but it's not functional. Once it's not functional, it's as good as not having it. So when the auditor conducts the compliance test, it will help him to know whether the internal control procedures, whether they're actually following it as they have planned to follow it. Then the substantive tests are those tests designated to validate, or rather authenticate, the accuracy of the account balances. Those figures that appear in the financial statement. Is it real? Where is it coming from? And of course, this substantive test leads to the end of every audit evidence, as in it's after the substantive test that the auditor can now express his opinion, which is the main thing we are looking out for. So the substantive test, as I've said, is just to confirm the figures in the account balances. And one thing is good to note here. If the compliance test he has conducted reveals that the internal control system is very strong, that they are functional, then it means that the level of the substantive test he will conduct will be reduced. He will not likely conduct the 100% substantive test. Just like I said in our previous lecture, that if the internal control is generally strong in the client's organization, it makes the work of an auditor very, very easy, because he will rely on it to some extent anyway. But if the internal control is not functional, it makes his work very, very tedious, because he had to start afresh to do everything in order to make sure that he gets a reasonable, he have a reasonable opinion to express. So let us look at the qualities of audit evidence. What are the qualities? What makes audit evidence credible? Number one is that it must be relevant. Number two is that it must be reliable. Number three is that it must be sufficient enough. So when you talk about relevance of audit evidence, we are looking at, it depends on the objective of a particular examination, because what is relevant in one case might not be relevant in the other case. For instance, if the auditor is expected to look out for ownership title of a moving vehicle, or a freehold land, or machinery, or plant and machinery, any assets, if he is expected to do that, then in examining the title of the freehold premises, it may be relevant to those that are located outside the premises, outside the client's organization. But if the premise or the vehicle or the asset is located within, he might not actually, looking out for the ownership title might not, it might not be so relevant, because it is domiciled within the location of the organization. So when we talk about provide, or rather produce an audit evidence, it's supposed to be reliable, because there's no way you can express your opinion on an information that you can't rely on. So that tells it all. The audit evidence must be reliable. It must be one that you can lay your hand, you can say, yes, this is actually what's supposed to be. And of course, it depends on the source of the evidence. The reliability of audit evidence primarily depends on the source of the evidence. Just like I said before, if you obtain an oral evidence and obtain the documented evidence, of course, the documented evidence can outweigh the oral evidence. So you can rely more on a documented evidence than oral evidence. Although some oral evidence might be relied upon, but one might be should be very careful or skeptical, because something that is oral might not be defended. But if it is documented, or if it is maybe recorded, as I'm doing now, one can use it, can comfortably rely on it. Then, sufficiency. The audit evidence must be sufficient. That is why we say there are so many sources. You obtain your audit evidence from so many sources. Enough source, it must be enough, it must be sufficient enough for you to be able to express or to draw a reasonable conclusion. It don't supposed to be one or two evidences or a very scanty evidence, because of course you have to document all your evidence. And as you, because the reason for documentation is to enable you come out of any litigation, or enable you be able to hand over to another incoming auditor. For instance, you have finished your own work as an external auditor for those years that is expected of you, and you are leaving the client. If another auditor is coming, he's expected to have those working papers to enable him to know where you stopped, and then to take off from there. We call it in auditing, what we call it is a professional etiquette. That is what we call it. So the information obtained should be sufficient enough. It's not supposed to be a scanty information, because there is this expectations that once you have enough information, then your work will be a grounded work. the audit assignment will you come out, the expression of your opinion will be very solid. It will be a very credible one. It will be one that nobody will be mincing word of on what you have done. So that is why it is good to have enough evidence, sufficient evidence to support your work. Even if you are called upon for any litigation, probably you did something and people reported you or something, you have enough evidence to prove yourself. If anybody challenges you in court, in a court of law, you have enough evidence to prove yourself when your evidence is sufficient. So I think we have to end it here. Let me do another recording for the audit risk, which is the last unit under this model. Thank you. I have finished. I have finished.
Okay, ma. So let me stop this one now. Then in the next 1 minute we'll